It's a great honor and privilege to have the duty of introducing our keynote speaker for the afternoon. I'm particularly delighted because I consider Kshemendra a good friend, but also he brings a very fresh view to a lot of the topics we've already talked about and will be talking about. I think you'll find this an interesting time for the afternoon. Some of you are old enough to remember when the Congress actually passed laws. And after the tragic and terrible events of September 11th, 13 years ago, there was a considerable concern and recognition that this whole field of information sharing was not being well managed or handled, particularly by various federal agencies. And so in response to that event, Congress did pass a law insisting that the president create what has been defined as an information sharing environment. That is to say, an environment in which it was okay to share information across the entire spectrum of federal agencies, and by the way, also with state and local and with international partners. So this was a breakthrough. They didn't know quite where to put it in the federal government, so they put it in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. That's just because they didn't know any better. But it was a White House directive that implemented this new concept of an information sharing environment. And initially, the former president, under whose offices this program actually got started, put a couple of ambassadors in charge as the program manager, and they were focused on high-level global terrorism issues and whatnot, but they really didn't get much momentum going until the present head of this office, the program manager for this information sharing environment, Kshemendra was appointed. And Kshemendra, I'm going to just say a few words more than is in your program about him, because he's really been preparing for this job his whole career in many ways. Kshemendra started off as a Silicon Valley high-tech chief technology officer. He is an engineer and a mathematician, but so he's what most of us remember as our nerd friends in high school. And so he knows the technology and understands the concepts of enterprise. And he was not very satisfied with his work in Silicon Valley and the high-tech entrepreneur, fast-moving space. So he accepted a call from the Justice Department in the U.S. government to be the chief enterprise architect for the Department of Justice, which was a role that hadn't been very well filled either. And in that capacity, he was tasked as a sideline to build a national data model for information sharing called eventually the National Information Exchange Model, Neem, which has become a standard now for health and human services, as well as justice and homeland security and the Department of Defense. So he got that started, and he was so successful that OMB beat him over the head and said, we here in the Office of Management and Budget work for the White House, and we're more important than your little DOJ people, and you have to come here and be the chief architect for the whole country. So he gave him this magnificent position of overseeing $80 billion in IT expenditures and strategies, and to come up with a federal enterprise architecture. Well, that didn't last very long, actually. He had a few years at that, and when the White House said, no, we really need you to come and get this information sharing environment together, because it's a mess. And so he accepted that assignment, knowing full well that the people he works for in the White House and elsewhere in government have no idea what he's talking about, right? So he has the job of educating as well as coordinating and explaining the value proposition of information sharing, which is why it's so fitting that he's here today to to share with you some of his, what he's been able to accomplish and is attempting to accomplish. It's just unbelievably challenging notion because he has no authority. He can't control budgets. He's not the guy in charge. He can't tell any federal agency what to do. He has to persuade them. Does this sound familiar to those of you in state government? There is no, we talk about what are the problems with some of these systems in health and human services and justice even. And, we have to always understand there's no one in charge, right? And that's the heart of our problem. So it's with a great deal of pride and privilege that I offer to you some of the words of wisdom from Kshemendra Paul.
Thanks, Paul. With an intro like that, I need to wrap this up and move to the Q&A. The slide says national security through responsible information sharing. And no, you're not in the wrong place. Right, this isn't a terrorism-related conference. This is not a national security conference. This is about how to spark transformation in the public health and human services space. And it's in particular about how to do it in a bottoms-up way, how to anchor with activities with the state and local community, bring that back, anchor with open government techniques. I was listening with interest to the previous speaker talk about open data, open government, critical aspect of large-scale transformation. I want to share a few ideas. As Paul is saying, I'm not a law enforcement guy. I'm not a national security guy. I just happen to dress like one. I'm an IT guy. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an electrical engineer by training, but what I use every day is high school civics, whole of government approaches. It's about collaboration in our federated democracy. And I think those lessons translate. So I hope that we can spark some thoughts that way. And I hope we have some interesting conversations. I'm sure we will. Paul was very kind to me. He's been a mentor, somebody that's been a fellow traveler in these activities, and really glad to have his association, his friendship. Okay, so national security through responsible information sharing is title. That's our vision for what we're trying to do with the information sharing environment. Down arrow, okay. Let's see, so there we go, got it, okay. So this is our scope. It's humongous, the only way to describe it. Entire federal government, state, local, tribal, private sector, international partners. 5 core communities: law enforcement, intelligence, defense, foreign affairs, homeland security. It started with a focus on terrorism-related information sharing. It extended in about 2008 to homeland security and weapons of mass destruction-related information sharing. Post-WikiLeaks, classified information sharing and safeguarding, most recently cybersecurity information sharing. Now, as Paul said, all of those activities are rooted in agencies, right? So our role is policy, leadership, standards and architecture, trying to drive collaboration across this really very broad community. Really, the way to think about what we're doing is focusing on interoperability, the white space between agencies. The IT industry here is shown as foundational. That again goes to the law and our strategy. We're supposed to take a distributed, decentralized approach. We're not building a big database in the sky. It's about interconnecting existing networks, databases, systems, driving harmonization of policy, common operating processes for the mission side. But the way we have to scale is by translating that into standards and architecture and working with our partners in industry so that you can use procurement tools. It's the only way to scale this kind of thing. I co-chair a White House Policy Committee, the White House Policy Committee on Information Sharing and Access. My co-chair is on the National Security Council staff. We have that top-down mandate, with that sort of thing. We work with the Office of Management and Budget, work with agencies. We can provide that top-down guidance, but as Paul said, and as you all live, right, you really can't tell public sector agencies what to do unless you're in the chain of command. And even then, it's hard, right? So, how do we drive progress? Well, we use the top-down. That gives us the power to convene. I have moral authority. I've got the ability to make a noise, to get out there and discuss an agenda and have folks participate in that discussion. That is important. but it's not nearly enough. We marry that with what I call the bottom-up and the outside-in. The bottom-up has been the most critical success for the office and the work we've done. And really that, let me go to the, yeah. So the bottom of this is cut off, but hopefully you can see that. This is what I mean by the bottom-up, right? We have a very large number of stakeholders, 750, 800,000 police officers in this country, 18,000 police departments, 90% of which have 50 or fewer sworn officers. Extreme fragmentation. The National Network of Fusion Centers, that's a core application of ours, a core initiative. Lots of different players. The key to the bottom-up piece is being able to provide that voice to our non-federal partners in the federal and the national policy process. It's been critical to the success that we've had with the National Network of Fusion Centers, with things like the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. How many folks, when you were traveling here, went through an airport or on the metro? If you see something, say something. Is that an initiative folks are familiar with? That's the Nationwide SAR initiative. That's a flagship for the office. Critical to its success is the fact that there's local control, right? It's not about just giving information to the federal government. It's about working with communities, police officers doing what they've done for 150 years in a community, seeing something suspicious, taking action to protect their communities. Just making that systematic, right? Consistent data standards, a consistent business process. Every state in the country has a privacy policy as comprehensive as the President's information sharing environment privacy guidelines, with the one exception of Wyoming. This is critical to maintaining legitimacy, right? And really having this feel like and operate like community-oriented policing. So I talked about the top-down, the bottom-up. The other piece I'd like to talk about, and I'll come back to that a little bit later in more detail, is the outside-in. That's working with the IT industry on the standards and architecture. Critical because how many of you are involved with large-scale IT development activities? How many of you are upstream of those or customers of those? So that may be the other folks in the room. And they all really go well, right? There's never any problems? Right? All right? Okay, well, so the big part of the problem is a lack of our maturity in how we do these things. Every time we do them, we start with a clean sheet of paper, right? We define requirements in an imprecise way, work with industry, the solutions come back. Wouldn't it be better if we could build leverage by using standards at the business process level, at the technical level? Wouldn't it be better if we had more consistent architectures, that we could engage with industry outside of a formal procurement, right, to define common approaches anchored in mainstream technology? Yeah, obviously it would be, and that's what we're trying to do with the outside in. And that's project interoperability, and I think that's something I'll get to in the end, and something we're going to really, I think, try to see if we can inculcate into the events over the next couple of days. So, National Strategy for Information Sharing and Safeguarding. This is, President Obama signed it out in December of 2012. We've been working with agencies to implement it. Three key principles: information as a national asset, sharing and safeguarding. You have to do that, two sides of the same coin. And the point of information sharing is to make better decisions, to enable, in my case, to better protect citizens and enhance national security. In your case, delivery of services to citizens, right? Each of those is kind of interesting. When you look at the first one, information as a national asset. So much of the information that we deal with today comes from transactional systems where it's point in time. But to really get the value from the information, we have to look at it across its life cycle, right? It's an asset. We have to safeguard it, protect the privacy of the people that are represented in that information, as well as safeguard it from an information security perspective. But as an asset, an intangible asset, you get value through sharing it within the right kind of legal and policy context. The issue is we have these transactional systems, right? The idea of sharing and safeguarding is usually an afterthought. It's not really built in as a first-rank requirement. The sharing and safeguarding, shared risk management. Things like identity, credential, and access management are critical to safeguarding, right? Enterprise data management, master data management to be able to do redress, effectively look at retention. Also, those are key issues on the sharing side. Really, they're the same thing. And the last principle, right, that the point of sharing is to make better decisions. That's an interesting idea. The Markle Foundation called it authorized use. But But the problem is we don't make policy based on classes of decision. We usually make policy based on classes of information, right? But if you want to build something, if you want to get something done, you got to work backwards from what are your requirements, right? So it's an interesting point that in the strategy here in a national policy document, there's a recognition of the need to shift focus a little bit. Strategy has 5 goals. The first one is all about governance, right? How do we build communities of interest, that span organizational boundaries, span levels of government to be able to actually have collective decision rights. Common standards, shared services, safeguarding information, privacy, the kinds of things you'd expect. We've got 16 priority objectives, and I won't get into all of these other than to think that and say that I think as you look at in the public health community, there's a lot of overlap in the kind of things I'm sure you all are looking at, right? How do you build the right kind of governance structures? Information sharing agreements. How do you go from point-to-point information sharing agreements that are bespoke to multilateral agreements that support policy automation? Data tagging. How do you look at describing and tagging information in a consistent way where those tags are meaningful across organizational boundaries, across domains of activity? Federated identity, credential and access management, baseline interoperability, things that really transcend, have nothing to do specifically with national security, are really about best practices for information interoperability. Okay, so coming back now to the topic of the conference. President Obama, during the HITECH Act, put a big focus on meaningful use of electronic health records, a big push on open data. Healthdata.gov is, really sparked a whole movement around using open data to transform in the healthcare system. A key thing that I think we want to get into is how do we look at transferring and looking at the lessons learned. Let me come back now to project interoperability and what we're trying to do to take the lessons learned, the best practices from a decade of terrorism-related information sharing and try to reuse those and extend those more broadly. So just to, a frame that I'd like to offer for folks, we make the distinction between communities of interest and communities of practice. Now, this is a little bit of an academic distinction. It gets blurred in practice, but notionally it's kind of interesting. We think of communities of interest as collections of organizations united by a shared mission challenge, common mission equities, trying to solve a shared mission problem, and within some kind of authoritative governance to give some confidence to the solution approach. We think of communities of practice as places where you anchor tools, best practices, lessons learned, methods of work. These two blend, obviously, right? You want to be able to use best practice approaches. You want to be able to reuse initiatives, but they're distinct also in an interesting way. And in particular, when you think of communities of practice, that's an open government concept. They're not necessarily, they actually shouldn't be anchored inside the 4 walls of government. Communities of interest, on the other hand, they need to be authoritative. It needs to be that there's decision rights. It has to be tied to budgets, policy, implementation plans, accountability, performance metrics. Interesting to kind of tease those out and think about that from the lens of open government. Because, going back to President Obama's open government memorandum, government needs to be transparent, needs to be participatory, needs to be collaborative. Well, if we take the community of interest lens on best practices, that makes it difficult to do that, right? Because best practices are best practices. They're usually anchored with standards organizations, academic groups, professional associations, public-private collaboratives, like communities, like Stewards of Change, like this sort of forum. The two blend, obviously. Some folks will, put on a different hat in different places. That was really the success of the Neem community, was being able to make that happen. Well, we use this idea as we think about project interoperability. So what have we done with project interoperability? We've taken a focus on the white space between agencies. We've looked at it from a mission and framework agnostic perspective, focusing on modular development. Now, with this modular development approach, it's, people talk about that a lot, but a lot of times it's focused on a single IT system, right? So, you've got a large-scale IT system. Somebody wants to break it down into modules. We're talking about modular development in a slightly different way. We're looking at it across a information sharing community of interest, right? Identifying a module that's common across that group. So, it'd be interesting to explore examples in the public health space and the space that I operate in. It's things like encounters, things like incidents, indicators that are common. The business process needs to be common across the different information trading partners. The tools that, that we've been able to distill into project interoperability are things like the National Information Exchange Model, things like the Federated Identity, Credential, and Access Management approach anchored under the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, consistent approaches to data tagging, some work on geospatial information, metadata management, approaches to describing functional standards through a common standards profile. A variety of tools that, and if I go through all of them, I'm going to be in danger of proving Paul right about folks don't understand what I'm saying, so I'm going to stop, but we can come back in terms of trying to figure out how to talk about them through the way they be used. The most interesting thing about project interoperability, though, isn't necessarily the specific tools. It's the fact that we're anchoring these tools now outside the four walls of government. Now, we have a standards coordinating council. This council is made up of 3 international voluntary consensus standard organizations, 3 standards organizations that are government-centric, including the NIST, 3 public-private collaborations, a couple of industry associations. These groups all came together under their own steam. Really, the only requirement was, one, they buy into the vision of the National Strategy for Information Sharing and Safeguarding and its focus on information interoperability, collective action, shared capabilities and services, protecting privacy, safeguarding information. And 2, they had a desire to coordinate their activity. So we are currently working through the process of more fully anchoring the tools and project interoperability into the working groups, forums, and task forces of the members of the Standards Coordinating Council. We think this is going to be tremendous in terms of making sure that we're not in a technology cul-de-sac. We're not doing the work of standards development within the government. We're tying more closely to the to our partners in industry and more broadly. It's also the case that several of the organizations have a strong state and local focus. With the work we've been doing in the national security space, we've had strong collaboration with the NASCIO, National Association of State CIOs, the National Governors Association, the National Association of Counties, National Association of Budget Officers, Procurement Officers, as well as the public safety organizations and leaders. We think that's important, and I think that's also an interesting point for this audience, in that one of the things that we constantly hear from our state and local partners is how we at the federal level tend to fragment government at the state and local level because of how grant money flows. How many of you work with your state CIOs? Just a few, not too many. Most of you have pockets of money that come through your own appropriation at the state level, augmented by grants coming from the federal level. Is that right? Does that describe more of the folks in the room? Well, those grants usually come with a set of strings attached, right, or conditions that cause that aspect of state government to orient on that aspect of the federal government, as opposed to driving an enterprise view. What we found in our dealings with our counterparts at the state and local level is that there's been a desire and a value placed on using national standards to provide more of an ability to get towards a common approach to standards and architecture and interoperability at the state level. So, going back to the idea about modularity, and I think this is a key kind of solution approach. I remember when I was at OMB a number of years ago, and I worked with my partners at NASCIO. They teed up something called START. Is this familiar to folks? Anybody? A few folks know about it. They wanted to take a common approach to benefits eligibility determination across Medicare, Medicaid management information systems. And they wanted to extend that, you know, to other types of health and human service benefits. You know, the idea being different states are all making these determinations. People move across state boundaries. Is there a way to drive a little bit of interoperability? Is there a way to drive some efficiencies, you know, rather than everybody building their own modules? That's an example of the modular approach. That's, you know, and what makes it different here is that you're looking at modules across multiple information sharing partners. Instead of looking at it as an IT thing, it becomes a business thing. So another example, the National Information Exchange Model. Now, you know, folks think about Neem as a collection of harmonized data elements, a federated model, different domains of activity. You know, the Administration for Children and Family have a domain in Neem. There's international trade domains. Law enforcement, justice is a domain. People are working on a cybersecurity domain. There's a biometrics domain. There's a bunch of different domains. But it's really the least valuable part of Neem is actually the data model. The most valuable part is that it's community-based, that there's active communities of folks that are passionate about information sharing and interoperability, and they have governance structures within which to work to try to come up with common approaches. Those structures are natively organized around the idea of a federated approach. That's really very unique and valuable about the Neem activity. A lot of other approaches to semantic interoperability come at it from a domain-specific view. So, you know, actually the predecessor for Neem was that way, something called GJXDM, Global Justice XML Data Model. The idea was it became this monolithic approach to the justice and public safety. And what folks discovered, and because of the pressure, because of 9/11 and all that, they discovered that taking that kind of a monolithic approach became, I'll share with you as long as you do it my way, right? So how many folks are familiar with that dynamic in the interoperability, right? I'll do it as long as you do it my way. Well, you know, the pressure because of 9/11 in the space that I work in was too great to allow business as usual on that score. So folks said, no, we can't do that. We really need a natively federated approach to bring different communities together. So, you know, that was the key, and that was what has allowed Neem to grow over the years. Not because it's the best, not because it has the biggest install base, but because people could actually find a way to come together and talk where it wasn't your way or my way, it could be our way. And so Neem has grown. The most recent is the Department of Defense. Now, anybody here under the illusion that it's, you know, the Department of Defense came into Neem willingly? Right? You know, DOD. Is there anybody here from the press? I'm going to get into trouble. Yeah. It was actually a long, long journey, 6-year journey. So this is you know, something that I think might be interesting to, you know, recount this journey. You know, an organization like DOD isn't known for sourcing core management and information frameworks from state and local governments, right? That seems like a little bit of a, and so the reason this worked is because different communities of interest all across the Department of Defense started using Neem on their own, whether it was the maritime domain awareness folks, the law enforcement folks, the variety of folks on the different combatant commands, just looking to solve problems, seeing a community that was open, just plugging into it and solving their problem. It was bottom up, right? They had a competing solution. It was called UCOR. It was a top-down, very elegant, very elegant. You know, people complain about the Neem data model that the center is too big and unwieldy. And they're probably right about that. The UCOR that DOD put forward was very sleek. It was a finely engineered thing. It didn't get the kind of traction, though. Why? Because it was top-down. It didn't have the community support. So eventually they killed UCOR, but they didn't mandate Neem, right? And they were faced with a groundswell, and there was a revolt, really, across the, you know, the different organizations in DOD, and finally that was what caused them to adopt it, is that they either get on the bandwagon or not. The lesson out of all that, again, is the importance of a multidimensional approach. It's important to have a top-down piece, but the most important is the bottom-up. The most important is anchored in these communities of folks that span organizational boundaries. And the engineering has to be good. It has to be tied to industry, right? It has to be tied to the mainstream of where technology is going. That's the outside in. The most interesting application of Neem for this community, and one of my favorites, I was jurying on a Best of Neem award, and it was 2009, and I was reading the applications, and I was surprised to see one from New York City Health and Human Services, HHS Connect. They were able to use Neem to tie together 36 federally grant-funded, locally administered programs to be able to provide 360-degree service to 4 million at-risk New Yorkers. Very interesting, and that was featured in the New York Times actually in July of 2011. It's in production today. What was wonderful about this, and it goes again to the open community approach and the importance of open government. The only reason I knew about it was because once they did the work, they wanted to get an award for it. And they got an award. That was the Best of Neem in 2009. As I mentioned, the Administration for Children and Family have a domain. HHS is a member of the executive committee for Neem. So another project I want to talk about using project interoperability. So talking about Neem as a tool within project interoperability. This is a project using a variety of tools around project interoperability. So we're working with the state of New Jersey. The vision there is that they want to tie together 476 police departments in the state, sharing low-level police information. Now, who here has a connection to the state of New Jersey? So a few folks in the back. There's a Passaic River Corridor, Route 21. You familiar with it? So it's the Newark, Hoboken, Jersey City, Patterson. It's a relatively high crime part of New Jersey, but 4 or 5% of the surface area, 50, 60% of the crime. That's a starting point for doing what they're calling corridor stat, but the idea that let's tie together the different police departments in that area, big departments, small departments, sheriffs, state police, to be able to coordinate activity, right? To be able to respond in real time in terms of intelligence-led policing, as well as coordinating resource allocation at the executive level. The key to doing this is interoperability. The reason we were able to make this work is 4 dimensions. Number one is there was statewide governance. So it's being run by the state police, but the state CIO is on board, from the governor's office, the attorney general, state association chiefs of police. You've got a governance structure that has a shared vision of sharing low-level police information to effectively enhance public safety. Number 2 is there's an operational innovation, this corridor stat I talked about, the idea that they're doing the equivalent of comp stat, but across multiple jurisdictions. And that's a regular rhythm to it. It's command-driven. The colonel of the state police, as well as a leader in that area, local police leader, are driving this. And they're actually measurably reducing crime rates around violent crime in that area using information and using this kind of collaboration. Third level of innovation is where we came in. It's better use of national standards, project interoperability. The key for them was using the ICAM capabilities, the Federated Identity, Credential, and Access Management capabilities. They've been able to define and deploy some standards compliant software that allows them to tie together the police departments and actually share information in a policy compliant way. And they were able to do it fairly cost effectively. It was really, this isn't huge dollars. It's pretty small dollars actually. The fourth level of innovation is the business model on procurement. So, and this may be familiar to several of you. In the state of New Jersey, something like 10 vendors, some very big, some small, control 40, 60% of the records management systems across those police departments. Does that sound familiar to folks where, they look in their states, it's like that? Some of them are mom and pop, some are national players, but every one of the procurements is separate, different rules, different, because of the statewide governance and because of the national involvement on the use of these standards that we've been working with industry on for some time, a fairly large number of those vendors have been playing. And they've put aside business model considerations for a pilot activity to see if this could work. what's really interesting right now, and we're not involved in this, but it's going on in the state of New Jersey with one of our partners on the Standards Coordinating Council, there's a rich discussion about what should be the business model in the future. Right? I mean, in the public sector, we have an interest in working with industry in a way where if we provide data or they're hosting data and we want to share that data, we shouldn't be having to pay a bill every time that happens, right? We can engineer the solution approaches up front to be able to be more efficient on information sharing. So those business model conversations are going on right now. And that's the fourth level of innovation, but it goes to kind of key to making this work in the future. Information interoperability can be about standards and architecture, and we can get into the weeds on that, but it's also about governance, it's about making an operational impact, and it's about the procurement and working with industry and our partners in all those dimensions. So that first picture up there, that's Hurricane Sandy. That picture down in the corner, that's Governor Christie in the middle, but that's taken in the New Jersey Fusion Center. So I talked about identity, credential, and access management as a key framework. And the frameworks we've been advancing, it's all fairly the same thing. This NASIO pushes forward something called SICAM, State Identity, Credential, and Access Management. At the federal level, there's FICAM. There's the NSTIC, National Strategy Trusted Entities in Cyberspace. At the standards and architecture level, there's a surprising amount of commonality. Of course, in the messaging, it's all confused. So that's an area where we have to do better. So I'm getting to the end here. I wanted to highlight a couple of other areas where there's some commonality. There's really is a nexus between public safety and public health that's emerging. Prescription drug abuse. One of the things that really shocked me when I looked at the numbers was in the previous decade, the decade of 9/11, 600% increase in accidental or unintentional deaths from prescription drug abuse. This is a chart from the CDC. I think it peaks around 22,000, 23,000 deaths a year. Huge number. As a nation, we've deployed prescription drug monitoring systems across the country. It's a fairly good success story. Every state has them. We're able to work through issues between the public health, public safety community. Some of the PDMPs are run on the public safety side, some are run by prescription boards, some are run on the public health side. There is interstate sharing across maybe a third of them, maybe a little less. But in general, what's happened is the street value of opioids, prescription opioids, is gone up a lot. Now, to the extent that there's good news here, we are starting to get a handle on this. It's also the case that information sharing environment frameworks are used in these PDMPs. The IGES Institute did something called Project Springboard. That's an industry-based certification of conformance with interoperability standards. That's all part of Project Interoperability. It was key to being able to roll these out in a way that that they worked. Kind of a second, kind of point of connection here is, as we've gotten a handle on the, or starting to get a handle on the prescription, drugs on the street, those prices have gone up, but the bad news is what's coming behind is heroin. But even there's a connection with the National Fusion Center Network I mentioned earlier. There's a concerted effort now with the Fusion Center Network partnering with public health folks across the country in different communities and states to start to more systematically track brands, encounters, purity, the variety of different factors, but in a way that we can roll up into a national picture. The public safety side, at least, is feeling like this is a really big deal, something that's going to help, at least on the enforcement side, related to heroin. Just two examples of where there's a public health, public safety nexus. It's not me suggesting that should be a place where you all start. There's a lot of other challenges, but it just reinforces the need, the absolute mission need for us to look at sharing best practices across different communities, whether it's public safety or public health. So, we can come back to takeaways, but there's a lot more information on the website. There's links to Project Interoperability. We took these tools, we put them up on a a GitHub site. We modeled after Project Open Data. As I said, we're actively working with the members of the Standards Coordinating Council to move future development of them into those organizations. So there's a lot more information on the website, www.ise.gov. But Paul, maybe we can have a conversation.
We have a few minutes left for questions. If anybody wants to pin Kshemendra down on what this all means, you're welcome to ask him. If you don't, I will. Yes, sir.
I'm the domain steward for the HHS domain. When I read the ISE website, it seems there's a lot of redundancy between Neem and the rest of the ISE. Did you all consider that as you were building it?
Yeah, a lot of redundancy. There's probably opportunities to streamline the presentation of project interoperability. So that's, we're at the front end of that. I think as we move the Neem program is a part of the Standards Coordinating Council. They're one of the government standards organizations. And so let me answer that question by telling you a little bit of a story. So, the Neem came up separately, right? It had some successes. One of the hardest things that I had to do was getting the Neem folks to work with international standards organizations. And in part because it's hard to change when you're successful. So the Neem community was successful, hard to change. The International Standards Group, the Object Management Group in particular, they're responsible for UML, Universal Modeling Language, the lingua franca for information management, Corba, a whole variety of model-driven architecture type standards. And, it was exactly the kind of conversation, the point you're raising, where the Neem guys said, well, we have it, we don't need those guys. And the OMG guys looking at the Neem guys and saying, what do these yokels have to teach us? And what we were able to do with partners on both sides and goodwill and a fair amount of hard work was to get out a UML profile for Neem so that we could converge the best practices that are in the government side and with the mainstream of industry. So doing that did expose a fair amount of overlap, right? That there was a lot of commonality in the approach, right? But there were slight differences. And because those differences were not managed, when you look at it from the outside, it's like you're solving the same problem two different ways, right? But by having the Neem UML, now we're saying, okay, no, we've taken mostly overlapping and made it precisely the same thing, right? So then that offers the opportunity to, kind of normalize the frameworks and make them more efficient. Building on that idea, we're currently working on Neem UML 3.0. We're also in that same process working with our European partners to align their equivalent of semantic assets with Neem, and that's going to be documented in the Neem 3.0 most likely. So the answer is, yeah, there is overlap in the different components, and the way we, you can look at that as saying that's good news, meaning we're actually getting to the same place somewhat independently. It's bad news that it's, exposes complexity that was there anyways, right? But then it's good news because now we have a pathway through the Standards Coordinating Council to iron that complexity out and, really remove barriers that might have been unappreciated in terms of interoperability. So.
Other questions or comments or arguments?
There's been a big push in human services to say that they're not special, they're not unique, that their issues in technology and things like that are like everybody else. Can you talk about kind of the expansion of the ISE and how you guys think about taking what you've learned in national security and applying it to other places, and whether you're finding that they're running into the same problems,
Yeah.
or can you just kind of expand on that?
Yeah, there's always the argument that, I'm unique, so I have to do my own thing. A lot of times that's just code words for I want to do my own thing, and I'm funded to do my own thing, and so I'll do my own thing. I'm a believer that there is a lot of commonality on the frameworks. Project interoperability is an attempt to, in its early days, it'll be clearer over time, but we think that a lot of what we're done in project interoperability is mission agnostic. And I think that that's an important point. I do think that there are differences. There are differences in how we handle privacy around PII, civil rights, civil liberties in the national security, public safety space, how we handle criminal intelligence, you know, and HIPAA and things like that in the public health space, right? So, but those are policy level differences. There's still a need to automate policy, right? There's still a need to harmonize policy. And you know, that process requires increasing amounts of precision in expressing policy. And you know, policy automation is not a new idea. It's something that's, the technology's been around for a long time. It always runs into problems, though, as soon as you cross an organizational boundary, because your governance between those boundaries is too weak, right? Or folks really don't see a mission need or an efficiency need or any kind of external driver to take on the hard work of harmonizing at the policy level, right? So they blame it on the technology. They say they're unique, but that's not really what's going on. It goes back to, do you have a mission need? And is there a context for doing this? That goes back to, you know, so I think that, you know, the only way to tackle interoperability that will work, I believe, is if you start with a mission problem that's shared across a community of interest, where there really is a need, you know, and you can define a module that's common, or the requirements for that module are common across the different information sharing partners. Is that benefits eligibility, like the NASIOS guys tried with a start? I think that's a great place to start, but you all are the experts, you know better than me. But a common problem that is recognized as a problem that can provide the impetus behind which you can use existing technology frameworks. So,
I will tell you that most of the technologists that I know that have gotten involved with using the toolkit that Kshemendra's office have created will tell you that the tools are agnostic. They're not really themselves defined around a particular domain. They serve any domain that chooses to use them. In fact, we have an example in the audience of Eric Jan, who's been applying the Neem model and the modeling processes to a HUD problem, and found Neem to be very useful in that environment. Eric, do you want to comment on that?
Thanks. It's been a difficult process. I don't want to take the stage here very long, but just really quickly, there isn't a lot of existing match in the core elements between HUD's terminology and the Neem. There's not a lot of buy-in within HUD HMIS, and there's not a lot of top-down impetus to move us in that direction, nor bottom-up. So it's a tricky situation we found ourselves in, where there are those of us who'd like to do mashups with Health and Human Services or other data sources, and it's a difficult proposition. A lot of times we don't have one specific exchange in mind. We have an enterprise set of data elements, an enterprise information exchange model we want to set up and let people play within that sandbox. So a lot of the Neem UML tools don't really facilitate that without bringing in a lot of law enforcement style terminology into our enterprise model. We've talked with the experts in the UML field on how to do that, and we're finding that there's not a lot of facilities for that, and so now we're starting to, we feel like we're reinventing the wheel by trying to constrain this to meet that need. So there's, it's been a tricky proposition in the HUD world.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the questions around the mission statement and some of the human services is, it's not really different. I mean, it's getting people to work together. But one thing that really strikes me as I listen to talking about national security is that there was a real, the governance and a real, statement of importance, from a very high level in our country, right, from the president's office, that people needed to work together. And I know just even in the conversations that I've had here, today, as we talk about interoperability in healthcare and human services, a lot of it comes back to, well, it's how the federal silos, the funding silos, and the, how we, how the different parts of the federal government, not putting all the blame there, but just, it kind of emanates from there of, there's silos and people are, they're programmatically, we think of things that way. Do you think that it's at all feasible that out of this work would come some sort of a broad sweeping statement from the highest level, the executive office, to say, you know, there needs to be a focus on interoperability around the healthcare and human services space to really provide that impetus for, you know, in those bureaucracies in our government, you know, at the federal level, but also then at the states and the county and, you know, other levels. We need to make this important. The technology is there, it could do it. Let's figure out how to work together. So I just, from the chair you sit in and how you see the world, do you think that's feasible at all?
So that's a great question. And so the piece that I would encourage you all to think about and embrace and use the time that you're here on is the role of state and local partners. The federal government is sometimes not the most innovative, the most fast-moving. You know, I have come to learn that my state and local partners have two big advantages over my federal partners. Two big advantages. Number one, you know, they're not burdened with the amount of money we have at the federal level, right? And number two, there's an inherent understanding and appreciation for the interjurisdictional nature of the challenges, right? At the federal level, there may be one lead agency for the nation on a specific mission topic. At the state and local level, you've got the inherent, you know, in the LA Basin, for example, 160 law enforcement agencies. Think about the New Jersey example I just gave, right? They all know they got to work together, and so there's a more of a push there on common approaches. So I would ask and challenge that, and I would also point out that we've made a lot of progress on national interoperability. I look at the Fusion Center network that I've talked about. The National Network of Fusion Centers, a real shining example. First time I know of where we have a national security asset in this country that's not owned by the federal government. It's owned by state and local governments. Federal funding for the national network actually dropped in the last year, but overall funding increased. Why? Because state and locals more than made it up. Each Fusion Center is meaningfully connected to local operations by a sponsoring agency in the area of responsibility. But there is clearly a national capability in terms of sharing information, crisis response, you know, threat assessments, and so forth. The national network is getting involved much more than CT and Homeland Security. It's also getting involved in human trafficking, countering human trafficking, the narcotics thing I talked about with the HIDAs and public health workers. So there's really an example here of state and local leadership. This is my remark earlier about using high school civics more than Fourier transforms and electrical engineering. Laboratory of democracy, the states, right? I mean, I really think that there is a key role for the states, and so I would challenge all of you that are, you know, coming from a state and local agency to assert natural leadership, you know, in conjunction with your partners at CMS, in conjunction with your partners in other agencies, but there is a role, and there, you know, that's the key lesson learned from the national security space. Now, you might not hear that from other national agencies, but the good news is I'm mission agnostic. I don't actually, I'm not the FBI, I'm not DHS, I'm not another big agency. I can tell you what I've seen in my experience is that a lot of our interoperability successes have been driven by state and local leadership and demanding transformation from the federal government, holding our federal feet to the fire. So, you know, that it could become the Burling platform, right? And so the federal government is good at responding, whether it's the legislative branch or the executive branch, to, you know, a unified voice coming from state and local partners. State and locals have actually a big voice when they can coalesce around a key platform. I think interoperability could be one. I mean, when you think about, you know, the amount of money spent on health and human services in the public sector, and you think about the amount of fragmentation, duplication, overlap, and gaps across our network, you know, across all these different solutions. And, you know, the answer isn't to pick one. It's got to be around interoperability, connecting systems, and then focusing on the information, and over time, rationalizing. So, yes.
I'm Adam Pertman. I'm with the Stewards of Change. You've done a lot of work around interoperability over time, and you've been pretty successful. And you've touched on some of the answers to the question I'm about to ask, but I wonder if you could focus, when we don't have, those of us who do not have a president who can order people to do things, what are the insights, strategies, arguments tactics that you have seen over your years of doing this that people can go home and apply,
Yeah.
who don't have as much sway, that they can actually go in and make those arguments, use those tactics? What are those insights that you've gleaned over the years?
So, let me think about my journey, and I'll share some things. I was at the Department of Justice, GS-15, Chief Enterprise Architect there. I came into government because I was attracted to the challenge, wanted to be a part of the solution post 9/11. And they asked me to do this thing called Neem. It was a R&D project, and everybody was yelling at everybody. There was a lot of strife. And how many folks have been there, right? So I didn't know better. I actually talked to my customers. So it doesn't work that way with federal IT normally. And in particular, I went outside the Department of Justice and worked with state and local partners. They didn't always understand what I was saying, or, and I didn't always understand what they were saying, but there was a degree of empathy and trust, and we actually made some progress, and it was about building communities, right? I didn't focus on, the specifics of the deliverable. I focused on, do we have a community of folks that are committed to work in this, and like that. The partner was DHS. At the time, DHS has become really a very strong partner over time on these information sharing issues, but back then, point in time, they were, it was a little hard. I define success as carrying them over the finish line, even if I had to literally carry them over the finish line. So it's the idea of a community paying forward. Again, the idea of community. I think working with industry is critical too. And I would challenge folks to be thinking about models for procurement, right? It may be a little easier at the state and local level. There's been a lot of conversations about procurement in the public safety law enforcement space with the state and local partners, and maybe there's some opportunity for some commonality between the public health folks and the public safety folks to, cross-fertilize on procurement. But in the public sector, when money gets involved, all of a sudden, it shields up. We're going to keep folks at arm's length. We're going to work our requirements. We're going to send them over the transom. And the procurement process ends up sometimes feeding an adversarial narrative, and that's no way to build a railroad. What worked was spending a lot of time engaging in open forums with industry, and it can't be cherry picked. You have to have open forums. I mean, it literally so that it's got a level playing field, right? Because we are the public sector. We have to be stewards of the taxpayer dollars, but working on requirements and solution approaches upstream from actual procurements. Right, and trying to go in that way. That's a big part of Project Interoperability. I talked about the PDMPs and their use of Project Springboard. So my office funded the original work on Project Springboard, but I didn't dictate which would be the first exchange that it targeted. When I heard that they were going to go in the direction of PDMPs, I thought that's a little funny, but okay, it's not for me to say. I was more interested in there being a capability versus. If I started dictating, then I'd be controlling the solution. It wouldn't be community-based. It's a big problem. It's an important problem. I'm proud of the success that the public safety, public health community has had with using the Project Interoperability Springboard, certification of conformance, and what that means in terms of lower cost, and the fact that we've delivered this national capability that most people don't understand exists, but has been material to improving public health and public safety in this country. So those are some ideas. Those are some ideas that I would throw out.
Kshemendra, I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask the last question because we're running out of time. But if this group were to decide between now and Friday to really establish a community of practice in health and human services focused on interoperability, what advice would you give this group on how to get that moving?
I think it'd be important, in no particular order, just off the top of my head. One is it'd be important that CMS and ACF in particular, there may be other federal agencies, SAMHSA, but the Administration for Children and Families and Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services provided some sponsorship, lightweight sponsorship. I use the example of what I did with Project Interoperability. It would be important that be a community-based effort, but capacity for that collaboration has to be tied to, I think, the federal partners here. I would really push for leadership from the state and local level, some mission owners, some operators, some leading edge CIO types that would have a vision for a shared, common mission problem that you could prioritize across a set of folks. Benefits eligibility, improper payments and fraud, some of the public safety, public health things, or prisoner reentry. I mean, it's for you all to determine, right, where there is mission demand and where there is support. And then you need to have some forums to work these. This may be a good forum, Stewards of Change, and I'm sure that there's lots of forums in the public health space. I would encourage folks to look at potentially the members of the Standards Coordinating Council. Paul, you're associated with the ISE Institute, and they're the leader, but also the international organizations like the Object Management Group, OASIS, Open Geospatial Consortium, ACT-IAC, others. Or you can, the SEC is not exclusive, so there's opportunities to bring additional organizations in. It's critical, though, to really make the point that my mission area is public safety, national security. I'm here because of a real passion around good government, information interoperability. I'm personally interested in being supportive, but my office is over here. Right? But the frameworks I champion, we want them to be used broadly, like the Standards Coordinating Council. I would love for the ISE Institute or other organizations to play a constructive role.
We'll steal whatever we can from your repository.